Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome you back to a new season of From the Editor's Desk, the podcast where we unpack some of the top stories which have or will appear in Compliance Week, look at top compliance stories, and more or less try to solve the world's problems. I'm your co-host, Tom Fox.
And I'm Ian Sherr. I'm the editor-in-chief of Compliance Week.
Ian, this is the first episode you've appeared, so I wanted to maybe start by asking you, could you tell our audience about your professional background?
Yeah, so I came to Compliance Week about a little under a year ago now, and I came here because I've spent a long time working on behalf of investors. I've worked for the Wall Street Journal, Agence France Presse, Reuters, CBS News. It's always been either investors or the public to really uncover a lot of stories that companies don't want you to know about. And it's been a really fun career. But one of the things that I've always found missing is that I would sometimes become friendly with a CEO or an executive or source or whatever. And we would end up talking about the life and problems they have at work. And I always felt a professional distance, right? Where I couldn't really give them very much advice. Sometimes it would be jokingly or sincere, but my job was really to have that distance and to be a recorder of history rather than an active participant. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about what Compliance Week represented is that we are working on behalf of our readers. And our readers, of course, is the compliance community, right? And everyone around them. We are helping you all do your jobs better. And sometimes that means taking medicine you don't want to hear, right? So I still get to annoy people with some stories that they may not be excited to have shared. But a lot of it is actually proactive in our stance. And I really appreciate that about kind of the way we think about things. I've had plenty of experience covering business, acquisitions, tech, all of the typical stuff that you see a lot of reporters who've been around have covered. But here I really feel like I get to take that itch I've had for a long time to want to kind of pull someone aside and be like, hey, have you heard about this thing? Hey, this might be a good idea. And that it actually isn't out of play for me. It's part of the job.
So you sort of burst on the scene, I will say, although you started, like you said, almost a year ago, but you burst on the scene with Compliance Week 2025. And that's where everyone finally had the chance to meet you in person.
Yep.
That was a big event for Compliance Week, 20th anniversary of the conference, back at the Mayflower. So I was wondering if we might start with some of your reflections about really starting out and introducing yourself to the greater compliance community at the signature event, Compliance Week 2025.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of what I've been enjoying is how open everyone is. It's enough to want to be a partner with your readers, right? And want to be supportive of them. But the open arms with which a lot of our members have, and the attendees, right? There's a mix of readers, attendees, members. It's a whole group of people toward us has just been incredible. And part of what I really found fascinating about the content of our national conference, and frankly, since I've shown up, has been that a lot of the biggest questions that exist in the corporate world are really flowing through this function, right? If you think about questions around the last 6 months alone, tariffs and the discussion of how policy is going to be implemented in the EU versus the UK versus the US, all of these types of things happening, you can kind of imagine a world in which it really makes sense that the people who these companies are coming to help understand and prepare for all of this are the compliance people. And not all of them have, by the way, compliance in their title, as I'm sure you've pointed out many times. I think it's really fascinating. We do, at least since I showed up, we started doing informal surveys every time people were in the room at our events. And we'd say, hey, how many of you have the word compliance in your title? Only about half the room raised their hands. The rest of them they're from all over the place, right? They're legal, they're IT, they're HR, they're all this other stuff. And in a lot of ways, what I've really loved about the way that we approached our national conference and everything since has been that it's much more holistic, right? We are looking at the broad view of what is it, the job of people who, in a lot of ways, are there to make sure a company's doing right and doing the right things and following the rules they need to. How do we support them? And that's, I think, honestly, there wasn't a single session where that conversation topic didn't naturally flow out. If it wasn't about how do we stay on top of what's right, it was how do we get buy-in from everyone else to follow what's right? And those are both really important things, right? It's not just the paperwork and the details, it's the soft skills. And I absolutely loved that this national conference really touched on a bunch of those issues both ways.
So Ian, the more conferences I go to, or perhaps I should say the more mature I get in my career, I come to enjoy the outside the classrooms or outside the conference rooms as much. Being in the hall, seeing people. Yes. And we are still at the point, I feel like, where everyone is so happy to see each other. Here we are 5 years post-pandemic, and I still feel that. I met a European woman named Vera Sharapova, who I've communicated with for years but never met. And she called my name, and I looked at it and said, Vera! Yeah. And we were both so excited to finally meet each other in person. But sort of having that connection, and I really wanted to use that as an introduction because you and your team were part of that. I walked into the bar after dinner one night, and you guys were in there just chit-chatting with folks and talking about stories and all informal, and all of us getting to know you and your team that we may not have known. Aaron, I think all of us know because he's been around for some time, but you've got some newer team members. Could you tell us who your reporting team is?
Yeah, so we've got a mix of people as we always have, but right now the people who you're going to see the most of the names are Adrienne Appel, right? She has history with Bloomberg as well, right? So she and Aaron both worked at Bloomberg at one point, which I never did, but some of my favorite competitors and friends did. There are plenty of stories about the difference between Reuters and Bloomberg and Dow Jones, but they worked there. And Adrienne has been really doing an incredible job looking at these stories about how does a company deal with stuff like greenwashing? And how does a company tell the truth in its marketing? And how do issues that are socially important, stuff like forced labor, how do they play into a lot of these conversations? Because we've had forced labor panels at pretty much every conference that we've run since I've shown up. And I'm very thankful that the team, being as thoughtfully engaged with the community as they are, had brought those to the fore as part of the programming. But what I've really enjoyed is that Adrienne especially has a real passion for a lot of the how are people impacted by business questions, which is just as important as how do you do business correctly? And she's been really great at that. And then there's Ali McDevitt, who you probably know best because she would publish our case studies every year. She did that amazing one on the culture of the Epstein banks that allowed Epstein back in the news, allowed the banks to really work with him and not see all those red flags that they should have and continue the problems. She's also done other really great stories about Carnival Cruises and Volkswagen and all sorts of other stuff. And those we even have separated on our site because they're such great in-depth profiles. And one of the things she and I have been working on since I arrived is that we both agreed we love doing these case studies. They're great. But one of the things that everyone always says to me is, we want more case studies. We want more and more. And yes, if I could clone Ali, I would do it in a heartbeat. But in the meantime, what we're trying to do is say, okay, how can we take the insights that are really valuable from these case studies and start weaving them into a much more predictable and regular pattern of publication? And so you're seeing that we're increasingly getting to the point where we're going to label them, but you're seeing that a number of stories that we've published over the last 6 months are effectively mini case studies, right? And that includes, for example, Costa Coffee in the UK, which if you're in the UK, you know about this. It's effectively Starbucks. They accidentally killed a 13-year-old girl. It's such a tragedy. because of an allergen issue. And the inquest that the UK government did around it was so fascinating because it found a lot of failures of training. And really, how do you make sure you're safe, right, in an environment like that? And of course, most of us look at corporate training like the thing that it is. It's annoying, right? No, none of us want to do it. I can't count. If I were to list the number of times I've gotten an angry email from above me, it's always about training, almost always. Why didn't you get it done? And I think all of us feel that way. And what's really fascinating about Costa Coffee, and it wasn't, by the way, just the coffee shop. They definitely failed, and the inquest showed that. But she was going to the dentist afterward, and she was in shock. And the dentist office, which also trains its employees in emergency medicine because they're dealing with stuff like Novocaine and whatnot, they didn't see that she was in trouble. And it wasn't until the very end when finally someone realized she needed an epinephrine shot that it was too late. And so it really became this amazing, retail, sure. But this is a really important story about the impact of something that we all see as benign and annoying. So that's an example of a case study, a mini case study we did. Another one that Allie did really great recently, we actually published it around Inauguration Day in January, was about with the conversation of crypto really exploding, right? And as we talk, crypto's coin is near its highest value right now. That one of the things that's been fascinating is what can we learn? We are now years past stuff like FTX and the failures that existed in the crypto industry. And a lot of us, when we lived through it and we remember it, and those of us who have nice elephant memories, we remember what that fraud looked like and the warning signs that came from it. But I had a history professor, one of my favorite people ever. He had this great saying he drilled into my head, right? I remember it years later. It's the 90 cubed rule. 90% of the American public will forget 90% of what happens within 90 days. And if you think about that, first off, you're like, okay, yeah, it's a little cynical, but it makes a little sense. But if you think about that, you really internalize it for a moment, right? And you really live with it. It means that we need to relearn a lot of the lessons that we learned from FTX because crypto is now another huge thing. Just not to flog Sam Bankman-Fried, although he's been found guilty of fraud, so he gets all the flogging he deserves. But really, it's about how do we make sure we're treating people right if this is going to be the future of how finance is done, or at least the next 4 years of governmental policy? And that was a great case study she did as well.
Maybe you could now add as the addendum the box score on the over-under for the length of time before he's pardoned by Trump.
There is, it has been, I think, wherever you sit on the spectrum, right? And look, I was born and raised in California. I went to University of California schools. It's not that hard to understand. I sit in a lot of these conversations, but that's not what's important. What I think we all agree on is that it has been really hard to identify what's going to come next from the White House, from Washington in general. And that is something that, once again, right, coming back to one of my favorite things to say about why I love my job, is that is the center of why knowing what the right thing to do, even if the government says, hey, we're not going to prosecute FCPA cases for the next 6 months to 4 years, knowing why it still matters to care about that and to actually make a louder voice about it than you did before.
I interrupted you while you were telling us about some of your key reportage team.
Yeah.
Did we finish that, or should we talk about some other folks?
We've got a couple of others. So we have regular freelancers as well. The ones who are worth noting specifically, who I work with the most, are Neil Hodge and Ruth Prickett. They're both in the UK. And they do a lot of our kind of notes from the East, if it were, right? East of us, where it's really giving us a sense of what is going on with UK and European law. And some of the most intelligent stories that they've popped up. First off, that Costa Coffee story was raised by Neil, and he did a fantastic job writing that story. That was one of the first features he did with me. I absolutely loved editing it. But the one of the other things they've been doing is talking about, as the UK is breaking away from the European Union, these issues that now exist for multinational companies of potential overlapping sanctions. If you dig into a lot of the theory behind the European Union is that they have a set of rules, but once you're punished by one country, you're not going to be punished 11, 12, 13 more times. it's one slap. And now with the UK separated, it's possible overlapping. Another thing, Ruth especially, she's been really great at talking about sustainability issues, right? Even though ESG may not be a popular political topic here anymore in the United States, it is very much an issue abroad. And in fact, with CS3D and CSRD, which those of us who know those letters, the corporate sustainability reporting and tracking rules that exist in the EU, those are very meaningful. And one of the fascinating things about it has been that she's done these great stories, really a bunch of them now, digging into how far down your supply chain are you expected to go to understand where these issues might be, including, back to talking about Adrian's topic, forced labor. There was a moment where we found out that a couple of the large companies in the UK, including some of the biggest food resellers, accidentally had forced labor in their supply chains. And you would think, like, a massive food retailer would know not to how to avoid those problems. And yet here it was. They were making some of the bread that was being eaten by you and me, thinking that these were professional organizations who had their stuff together. And it underscored how they struggle, first off, to really be able to nail these things even when they care. But secondly, also, it really showed how even a company you think this would be table stakes, that as they are getting to a point where they have to report these things and they have to actually identify it in their supply chain, it's a lot worse than they thought it was. And that itself is a fascinating topic because, of course, everyone else who's reading Compliance Week, we've got the Fortune 1000 reading us, but everyone else is learning from them, right? It's just these issues are hitting them first. But make no mistake, it's going to hit the rest of them. And Ruth does a great job telling those stories.
I was wondering if you might be able to highlight 2 or 3 of the stories from May and or June that either moved you or really impacted you, or you really wanted to highlight the reportage that your team did, if I can use that word.
There were a couple of things. So first off, I do need to point out, you mentioned national. One of our favorite things we do during our national conference is we have the Excellence in Compliance Awards. We've been doing it for several years now. And there are some really amazing people who get recognized. This year, Lisa Fine and Ellen Hunt, we all know very well. We very much love and appreciate all that she does, that they both do for the community. But what I also very much enjoyed was that it was an opportunity to shine a light on some of the people who are doing some really important work. And one I wanted to point out in particular, there are actually 2. One is the Red Cross in Ukraine, who won Compliance Program of the Year. And first off, most people's instincts would be like, okay, yeah, war zone, you get Compliance Program of the Year. It is not by default, okay? I'm not just giving it to people in a war zone. Part of what really moved us as we were reading through the story of the Red Cross in Ukraine, and you can read about it, of course, on complianceweek.com, was about how they were able to stand up a whole compliance program inside of 20 months from basically zero. And not only stand it up, right? It's easy to say, oh, we have this on paper, but to actually be able to then do investigations and remediations. They were actually doing the work. And it was just incredible to hear how much effort they put in a situation where most of us, I think, would be struggling to even wake up every day and understand what's going on. And here, these people it was incredible. So they were one example. The other was from ADQ in Abu Dhabi, who got one of our rising stars in compliance. I was really impressed. One of the people who's working in the compliance team there, her name is Fatima. She did this incredible work creating these ideas like compliance crosswords and even an escape room experience, right? Those of us who have been through an escape room experience where she tries to get people to kind of learn the basics of cybersecurity and compliance and all of these types of things and trying to make it fun, right? Because one of the things I think we all understand is that there is this perception, whether fair or not, that we are the stuffy, boring people who are just telling you to follow the letter. And she just did this great job really trying to bring humanity and heart to it. And so we thought that deserved a lot of attention. So those are examples for that. But the last thing I'll point out is we've been covering the CFPB left and center, right? And most people have, right? It's been one of the most dramatic parts of the Trump administration's decisions. But what I think and what I've appreciated, and this is everybody, Aaron, we have a freelancer, Oscar, who helps us with editing as well. He's been here a long time. He does a lot of really great work too, helping with tech. All of them, as we've been covering the CFPB, we've been trying to think through, what does this say about the future of American regulatory policy? Because it's easy to look at the DOJ and say, okay, that is where the heart of how we can figure out how the government's going to be doing is. But we've taken each one of these kind of minor things that happen to the CFPB, and none of it's minor, but these changes that happen that seem to happen on a daily basis. And we've really been able to turn it into quite the story and really in real time dissect, what does this mean about the way that the government looks at consumer protections? What does this mean about the way that federal agencies are being defanged or not? And what does this mean about the approach to policy and to regulatory enforcement? And so that is something I also really wanted to point out, is just you can get exhausted covering this stuff because it's just day in, day out. It's nonstop. People complain, oh, this move is illegal. Oh, this is not okay. Oh, this is destruction of whatever, blah, blah, blah. It happens a ton. And being able to look through that and really see the through line of this is what it means for the rest of us is a really hard job. And I've been really impressed with how well the Compliance Week team's been doing that.
Let me turn the focus a little bit to two conferences you held in June, both in Austin.
Yeah.
One third-party risk management and then women in compliance. I was wondering if you might highlight both of those for us a little bit, Ian.
Yes. So one of the things I've been doing since I showed up is I've been asking the team to really try and take the insights that we get at our conferences and get them on the page a little more, because the overlap of readership, membership, and attendees is not as big as you would think. And apparently this is pretty typical. You don't have a ton of members who are also attending a conference, or you don't have a ton of conference attendees who are also regular readers. And it makes sense, right? Some people want to meet in person and learn in person. Some people want to learn through reading. Fine. But they all have something to learn from one another. And so there's a really great feedback loop where we take what we've been writing and we apply it to the conferences. But I wanted to start the other half of that loop. And one of the things we've been doing is trying to take, okay, how can we share these insights? So during TPRM in particular, a lot of the themes that came up during National and that we've been touching on ever since I arrived and even before, really were solidified during that conference. And I think part of it is because TPRM has become a kind of central issue within compliance, right? All of the things that we can debate, right? AI, data governance, ethics, you name it. All of it in some point revolves around the question of how TPRM is handled. And so there were some really fascinating conversations that happened, including a major tech company who shared about how they have been trying to actively kind of work against a lot of the myths that exist in TPRM. The idea that if you have a really long questionnaire, that every third party, you have to subject them to it before you start working with them, that will keep you safe, right? Obviously, you sit there, you think about it as, of course, a long questionnaire doesn't solve anything. We all know that. But getting an organization to actually really believe that in their bones is actually a lot harder. And so that was a really great part of the conference. I think the other thing, and this came up during WIC as well, was the conversation around soft skills. And not just how do you get people on board. That is always a conversation, and we have all been there. But also, how do you make sure that you're advocating for what matters, when it matters, and what's important, and then also for yourself. It really struck me, there was a point where we were at Compliance Week Europe back in October, and someone in the room asked, should I stay in this job because I want to be a CEO someday? And I don't know whether or not having this on my resume is going to actually ever help me. And it really was striking, because then at National, we had this whole conversation that happened about whether or not boards really need to be rethinking the way that they are structured. Boards right now, most of them are accounting people and business development people. They're not compliance. It's not a big group of people in the boards. And so WIC went that extra step further. How do you, as famously in the book, how do you send the elevator back down? How do you really get other people to believe in this approach of we need a bigger variety of voices in the room. And also, I have to say, the thing I loved about WIC as well was that there was so much conversation about mentorship and about humanity, right? Which is just something that you don't hear in business conferences very often. And I'm really lucky. I've been able to find mentors who were incredible. And I'm an outgoing personality. So as a result, there's a part of that makes that easier for me. But for people who keep to themselves, and let's be honest for a moment, compliance is not a function of business that's known for being extremely loud or outgoing, that really helping a lot of these people who are not the natural biggest, loudest people in the room learn how to find their own mentors and their own people who are going to support them was really, it was just incredible to watch. And I remember how touched a lot of people felt because they'd never talked about what their career goals were in any way other than when they were getting hired. And it's so heartbreaking to know that, but also so rewarding to see them really get that moment and really get to think about what are they doing 8 hours a day, right? What are they doing for a quarter of their lives? And does it matter to them? And how do they make it better? That's amazing. And so that's why it's women in compliance is what we call it. But I keep saying women and allies in compliance because it's all of us, right? We all go through this. Yes, it's especially important because women are underrepresented. And a lot of people are underrepresented, by the way. And it's not just women. There's a lot of subsections of that as well. But I think that also it's really critical that we understand that we all need to think about everybody as needing some help sometimes. And that was a point where that conversation really came through.
If I could ask you to maybe turn your head a little bit to July, and are there any stories you're working on that I might be able to get a teaser out of you that we could look forward to reading next month?
Yeah, one of the case studies that we're looking at now, we're still getting it worked through, but we're really trying to dig into that question about the tone from the top. We saw this with TD Bank, where if you read through the court filing from the government, which of course Aaron and I did, you find that one of the things that the investigators found over and over was this issue of tone from the top, right? That the executives, the board, they underfunded their AML efforts. They didn't put as much kind of attention toward the compliance programs as maybe they could. And as a result, people who might have seen red flags didn't raise them as much, right? People didn't take it as seriously because of the result of that tone. And we wanted to kind of take that idea and go a next step. So we're starting to look at a couple of stories that look at really what does it mean when a company makes a decision and that decision point ends up becoming something you see years down the line as the mistake. Because as we were talking about the 90 cubed rule, it's really easy to point at a company screwing up now and saying, see, couldn't you tell? Obviously. But if you go back in time to where that decision point was, to the moment where they decided to do something that then touched off all these issues. A great example is working in a very hostile territory, right? And maybe you're in a situation where suddenly you're caught because some of your employees were bribing a terrorist group not to bomb their factory, right? Which was, by the way, a conversation at CW Europe and then again at National. Really fascinating conversations and real life stuff, right? Some of these people are struggling with it right now. But what was interesting is that every time we talked about it, they said, why didn't the board see this as a problem in the first place? Why didn't the executives think that going and working in a war zone would bring you to this problem? And instead, the people taking the fall are the people who are dealing with the question of, do I let my workers get bombed or not? And so we're really trying to think through a lot of that in some of those stories. So you can look forward to more coverage that touches on that. That'll be your little taste. The other thing also is that I mentioned, we really are thinking about how we take that amazing energy that, Tom, I know you felt at National and bringing it out in a lot of our coverage. And we're starting to expand the way we think about these things, taking some of the insights from these conferences and really applying them beyond daily news. And also even getting into stuff like a lot more news you can use, right? How do you speak up in a boardroom and not get fired? That is a really tough conversation that permeated every one of our conferences so far that I've been to. Every one of them, people are like, okay, yeah, but I'm worried I'm going to get fired for this because I'm trying to do the right thing. And it's obvious that it's something that people really need to hear a lot about. And I would argue it's something that sits in just as much importance as the conversation around regulatory policy and enforcement and everything else we're covering. So we're trying to really think about how do we broaden the field of what we're covering while also still making sure that we're providing the up-to-date information you need. So you're going to see a lot more of that over the summer.
And this has been a great inaugural episode of From the Editor's Desk with you. I wanted to thank you again, and I look forward to continuing this conversation next month.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Tom.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.